Hey everyone, welcome to the New Populist. I'm Dave Brown. If you are new to the channel, please like and subscribe. Well, right now we are about 6 weeks into this Russia-Ukraine war, and the American public, for the most part, we've sort of gotten used to it. I know when this first broke out, people were worried about nuclear war and the U.S. being dragged into this conflict. And of course, enough time passes and people sort of normalize this war and start to lose interest. And right now, I think the American public somewhat is losing interest, although the media, all the blue check marks are still fired up. They want to talk about this because they don't want to talk about the domestic situation in the United States and the fact that we have a president who, if you saw that clip with Obama and Kamala, clearly is not in charge, clearly is a puppet, and his mental faculties are clearly in decline. So when you have the situation, you focus on an enemy that you can sort of rally everybody around, which is Russia and Putin, and convincing us to focus on that and not focus on what's going on within the United States. But I don't do that. I want to understand this conflict better, look for more information, and I have found more information. I actually heard about this one thing from some other podcasts and YouTube channels, and that is the RAND Corporation, which is a think tank, and they put out a paper in 2019 talking about Russia and how the United States could, in their words, overextend and unbalance Russia. Now, I want to go through this paper because we are seeing some of the results of things that happened that were brought up in this paper. Now, of course, RAND Corporation doesn't make Pentagon policy, but they are a player, and they probably think along the same lines as the Pentagon and the State Department. So it's interesting to go through this paper to see what they said and what we've actually done over the last 3 years since this paper came out. And we have done some of these things. And again, I'm not pro-Putin, I'm not pro-Russia, but I want to better understand why things happen. And they want to make it seem as if everything was hunky-dory, we weren't doing anything. For no reason at all, Russia, the big bad wolf, decided to invade Ukraine with no warning. And we were completely innocent in all this, just the good guys. And of course, as you know, the world is a grand chessboard, and we're constantly fighting over land and resources. And this war is no different. We have our geopolitical objectives. So does Russia. I'm an American. I take our side, but I also want to take our side, but not take our side blindly, where I don't acknowledge where we can make situations worse by our actions. And so I want to go through this paper, and I want you to focus on what they're talking about as how we can antagonize and sort of hit those nerves in Russia in order to make them unstable. And of course, for every action, there is a reaction, and we're seeing that reaction right now. So the title of this paper is Overextending and Unbalancing Russia, Assessing the Impact of Cost-Imposing Options. Now, this is the start to this article. This brief summarizes a report that comprehensively examines nonviolent cost-imposing options that the United States and its allies could pursue across economic, political, and military areas to stress, overextend, and unbalance Russia's economy and armed forces and the regime's political standing at home and abroad. Some of these options examined are clearly more promising than others, but any would need to be evaluated in terms of the overall U.S. strategy for dealing with Russia, which neither the report nor this brief has attempted to do. Today's Russia suffers from many vulnerabilities. Oil and gas prices well below peak that have caused a drop in living standards, economic sanctions that have furthered that decline, an aging and soon-to-be declining population, and increasing authoritarianism under Vladimir Putin's now continued rule. Such vulnerabilities are coupled with deep-seated, if exaggerated, anxieties about the possibility of Western-inspired regime change, loss of great power status, and even military attack. Despite these vulnerabilities and anxieties, Russia remains a powerful country that still manages to be a U.S. peer. Now, one thing they talk about here is this Western-inspired regime change. Now, of course, if you're familiar with the color revolutions, we have done this before. We did this in Georgia, the Rose Revolution. George Soros donated something like $42 million as part of this effort to overthrow the government there. And of course, the Maidan Revolution in 2014 in Ukraine, where Soros spent like $180 million. And remember, he's not operating by himself. When I say Soros, he's sort of the figure that we all can focus on because he's visible. But our State Department, our CIA, they're all involved in these things. And of course, Putin sees this, which is why after the pro-Russian government in Georgia was overthrown, he invaded Crimea. And after the Ukraine government was overthrown in 2014, that began hostilities between those Nazis in Ukraine and the Donbass region, which was primarily pro-Russian. So we fund and support these regime changes under the guise of exporting democracy in order to put in governments that are essentially our puppets, because after we overthrow these governments, what do we do next? We loan them money. Think about it this way. It's like the mob. If some guy in the mob loans you money, you basically work for him until you pay it off.
I said, I'm telling you, you're not getting $1 billion. I said, you're not getting $1 billion. I'm going to be leaving here. And I think it was, 6 hours? I said, I'm leaving in 6 hours. If the prosecutor's not fired, you're not getting the money.
And that's what we do. We put in our pro-Western government, we give them money and weapons, and now they work for us. And Ukraine is no different. And that's why Russia has had the reaction that they've had. But to continue on with this article, it goes and mentions 3 different options for unbalancing Russia. Providing lethal aid to Ukraine. And of course, we've already done that for the last several years. John McCain and Lindsey Graham were in Ukraine in 2016 talking about, we're going to get you this lethal aid. And so that's one thing that has happened. And it says here, providing lethal aid to Ukraine would exploit Russia's greatest point of external vulnerability. But any increase in U.S. military arms and advice to Ukraine would need to be carefully calibrated to increase the cost to Russia of sustaining its existing commitment without provoking a much wider conflict in which Russia, by reason of proximity, would have significant advantages. Well, they said this in 2019. Well, what's happened? They invaded Ukraine, and Russia has the significant advantage, which is probably why they did it. So if you're wondering why Russia invaded Ukraine, they said it right here. We can provide this lethal aid to Ukraine, but it could provoke a wider conflict. So again, my point is always this. When we did these things over the last several years, the United States, we knew what might happen. So when Russia reacts the way they react, we should not be surprised and pretend it happened out of nowhere. And that's what the Western media would have you believe, that this happened out of nowhere. And they don't understand it. Russia's just a bad guy. No, we have people in the United States playing on the chessboard. And they're making all these moves. But of course, the thing is, Russia makes their own moves. And that's what they've done. Another option, increasing support to the Syrian rebels. But it goes on to say, increasing support to the Syrian rebels could jeopardize other U.S. policy priorities, such as combating radical Islamic terrorism. Well, we did that in Syria. We were actually arming ISIS during the Obama administration. We're trying to overthrow Assad. That didn't work. All we did was prolong that war, cause more death, and eventually Trump said, why are we giving weapons to ISIS? This is crazy. So he stopped doing that, And then he, as he would say in his own words, he bombed the shit out of them. So we did that. And we actually had this sort of the ceasefire with Russia, not directly with Russia, but with the Syrian forces there. And we sort of stabilized things as much as we could by stopping this policy of trying to arm rebels to overthrow governments that we don't like, because it generally backfires on us. And it did not work in Syria. So in 2019, they're talking about doing this, and we haven't done that as far as I know. And the other thing they say is promoting liberalization in Belarus. Now, this goes back to what? The color revolutions. That's how we do it. We promote liberalism. We promote democracy in order to overthrow the existing government that is pro-Russia. And it says here, it likely will not succeed and could provoke a strong Russian response, and one that would result in a general deterioration of the security environment in Europe and a setback for U.S. policy. Now, of course, we know that Belarus and Russia are tied together at the hip. The leader of Belarus, he basically does what Putin says. So, as they say here, it would likely not succeed. So we didn't even try that, as far as I know. But again, they're calling it liberalization, promoting liberalization. It's such a fraud. So that's not what we're doing. And it goes on here to give this graph here, or this chart, to show the likelihood of success, the benefits, and the cost and risk. And here it has providing lethal aid to Ukraine as being a moderate likelihood of success, and with high benefits but a high cost and risks. And again, we've seen how that played out. Right now, Russia and Ukraine are at war. And one thing though, we did give them that lethal aid, and it has helped to inflict a fair amount of damage on the Russian military, especially those Javelin missiles that are really effective against those Russian tanks. So, as some people have said, maybe our goal was not to have them beat Russia. Of course, that would never happen, but to make this very costly for Russia. And right now, it seems that that is the foreign policy objective of the United States right now. Ukraine's lost. They're not going to win anything. But we want them to basically make it as difficult as possible for Russia to make this a very costly conflict for Russia. And that is our reason for giving them lethal aid, not to protect them, to save them, but to make sure when Russia invades that it's very costly for Russia. And it seems to have some effect in that end as far as costing them equipment and, of course, the lives of their troops. And then there's three more options here, and this is funny. Diminishing faith in the Russian electoral system. Now, there's a little irony here. We freaked out in 2016 because we claimed that Russia was interfering in our election. It was an assault on our democracy, and it could not stand, and they installed their puppet, Donald Trump, in the White House, right? Notice how flippant we are about diminishing the faith in other people's elections. So if it's good for us to do it to them, why not them do it to us? And that's where I try to tell other Americans that, hey, yes, we're Americans and we look out for our own interests, but if we're mad at somebody else for interfering in our elections, don't they have an equal right to, if we're say, promoting the interference in their election, they have the equal right to say, hey, we're going to interfere in your elections. And we've interfered in so many different countries' democratic processes over the last 100 years. It's unreal. Yet we get so upset when we claim or say that Russia interfered in our process. So yeah, here we are in 2019, the Iran Corporation saying, hey, how can we destabilize Russia? Let's interfere in their electoral process. But it says it will be difficult because of state control over most media sources. Doing so could increase discontent with the regime, but there are serious risks that the Kremlin could increase repression or lash out and pursue a diversionary conflict abroad that might run counter to Western interest. They said a diversionary conflict abroad. Is that Ukraine? I don't think it actually applies in this context. There's two more here. Creating the perception that the regime is not pursuing the public interest. Could focus on widespread, large-scale corruption and further challenge the legitimacy of the state. But it is hard to assess whether political volatility and protest will lead to a more extended Russia, less able or inclined to threaten Western interests abroad, or to a Russia more inclined to lash out in retaliation or to distract, making this a high-risk option. And of course, what do we say about Putin? He's a thug, he's a multi-billionaire, and he's not a friend to the Russian people. Well, there's some of that is true. He is definitely a billionaire. He's definitely done well for himself and his family. Our perception is that he's a authoritarian that is forcing himself on the Russian people. But if you look at polling in Russia, if we are to believe the polls, he is quite popular in Russia. So we can only look at it from, again, our American eyes. But if we were to ask the average Russian citizen, do they think Putin is doing a good job for their country, they might say yes. So according to the polls, Russians seem to like him. So if we're trying to make that perception, it's not working. The other thing here, they say, encouraging domestic protest and other nonviolent resistance. And once again, we encourage protest in Ukraine. We encourage protest in Georgia. What if Russia encouraged protest in the United States? What would we do? Well, we'd freak out and go, how dare they involve themselves in our internal politics? Yeah, once again, one of our strategies, and we've done it all over the world, is to encourage protest and nonviolent resistance in other countries to topple their governments. And so here we are saying, is that a viable option? And we've done that to some extent, but again, because of the way Russia is set up, it's not really a thing that's actually going to work. So that's one I don't think we've done to any great extent. And the last one here, and this one we have done, undermining Russia's image abroad. Undermining Russia's image abroad would focus on diminishing Russian standing and influence, thus undercutting regime claims of restoring Russia to its former glory. Further sanctions, the removal of Russia from non-UN international forums, and boycotting such events as the World Cup could be implemented by Western states and would damage Russian prestige. But the extent to which these steps would damage Russian domestic stability is uncertain. While none of these measures has a high probability of success, or any or all of them would prey on the Russian regime's deepest anxieties and might be employed as a deterrent threat to diminish Russia's activity or active disinformation and subversive campaigns abroad. Now, that is definitely happening right now. If you're all, for example, the Russian oligarchs, they're having their property repossessed. One guy had his boat sunk somewhere in not Eastern Europe, somewhere, I think it was Italy or Greece. The Russians are being banned from certain competitions, and it's really kind of embarrassing to see how we're reacting to Russian citizens living abroad who have no control over the actions of their government. And we've definitely gone down that route after this war started, and even a little before, to tarnish Russia and to try to hurt Russia's image abroad. And right now, of course, it is firing all cylinders. We're definitely doing that. And again, I think our long-term goal is to overthrow the Putin regime. And we've seen that with Lindsey Graham and his idiotic statement saying, we need this Julius Caesar moment where somebody around Putin takes him out. I think that really shows our desperation if we're actively telling, saying, please, somebody take him out. That's essentially saying we can't do it and we can't stop this guy. So please, somebody in Russia who's close to him, please take him out. And that's not going to happen. So we're trying to overthrow this regime. We're not going to be successful. And within Russia, people have to understand this. We view Putin as being isolated. That's how he's showing the media as being isolated and scared of the people around him, and that is not the case. Any leader, even one who we might think is being authoritarian, has to have the support of the elite class around him. If he doesn't have their support, they will take him out. And Putin's been in power for 20 years because he has the support of the ruling class in Russia. So he's not executing this war in Ukraine on his own volition by himself. He definitely has the support of the Russian ruling class, and he could not operate in a vacuum by himself. Any leader, even the strongest ones, have to have support by influential people within their country to do what they do. And Putin certainly has that, so he will not be taken out. And so finally, the conclusion of this paper: the most promising options to extend Russia are those that directly address its vulnerabilities, anxieties, and strengths, exploiting areas of weakness while undermining Russia's current advantages. In that regard, Russia's greatest vulnerability in any competition with the United States is its economy, which is comparatively small and highly dependent on energy exports. Russian leadership's greatest anxiety stems from the stability and durability of the regime, and Russia's greatest strengths are in the military and InfoWar realms. The table below draws from the earlier tables to identify the most promising options. Most of these options discussed, including those listed here, are in some sense escalatory, and most would likely prompt some Russian counter-escalation. Thus, besides the specific risks associated with each option, there is additional risk attached to a generally intensified competition with a nuclear-armed adversary to consider. This means that every option must be deliberately planned and carefully calibrated to achieve the desired effect. Finally, although Russia will bear the cost of this increased competition less easily than the United States will, both sides will have to divert national resources from other purposes. Extending Russia for its own sake is not a sufficient basis in most cases to consider the options discussed here. Rather, the options must be considered in the broader context of national policy based on defense, deterrence, and where U.S. and Russian interests align, cooperation. And so it's stating explicitly here, there are risks here. We are escalating, and there will be a counter escalation. So 3 years later, from when this paper was written in 2019, we have seen the response from Russia. They said, now is the time, we're going into Ukraine, and you can't stop us. And that's where we're at now. So again, my whole thing is not to defend Russia, not to defend Putin. The slaughter of all these Ukrainians is tough to watch. My whole thing is trying to understand how we got here and what our government has done to get us here and what they've done to participate in this build-up to this invasion of Ukraine. And while Putin has his share of blame, our foreign policy gurus and those people in the Pentagon and the State Department and these think tanks, they have some level of culpability in antagonizing Russia, trying to unbalance Russia, overextend Russia, and to push Russia into actions that we think will be beneficiary for us, the United States, even if it's at the expense of Ukraine being destroyed. And again, I've said in other videos, it's a very cynical take. Perhaps we always knew that Russia at some point would invade Ukraine, and our entire goal with arming Ukraine was to just make it costly for Russia to invade Ukraine. So when they did it, they will lose a lot of personnel, a lot of tanks, and it will damage their economy. So maybe Ukraine was always just a tool or weapon against Russia rather than this sincere belief in democracy and the beauty of the Ukrainian people, as our media and politicians would have you believe. And that's what they're singing right now. And I've seen these politicians turn a blind eye to all sorts of atrocities across the world, some that we've had our hand in, and they never cared. So anytime the politicians and the mainstream media have compassion and caring about a group of people across the world, I go, I don't buy it. I don't believe you. You guys are cold and heartless, and I doubt that you're really that concerned about the Ukrainian people, as you've watched over the last several decades, people all across the world be slaughtered, and then not a peep from the mainstream media or our politicians. So that's, it sucks to sort of look at your government and your media that way, but I'm a realist, and I have no evidence to suggest otherwise. That's just what I see with my own eyes, examining the situation and evaluating it. So that's where we are now. And going forward, again, my goal is we need to understand these things to make sure in the future that we can hold our politicians, our media members accountable for what they're doing to make the world a more unsafe place, a more unstable place. And I ultimately want to see some sort of levity brought back to our government where we can try to live peacefully with other powers in this world. It's not a zero-sum game. Just because, our power doesn't come at the expense of somebody else. So for us to be successful doesn't mean that Russia or China can't have some level of success and exist within this world. We can exist together. We have to change this attitude that we have to destroy them and we have to antagonize them and push them. Doing that is only going to make the world a more unstable place and set us up for more conflicts in the future, which seems likely at some level. And in the future, our next big challenge, of course, will be China. And if I'm watching our political class screw up so badly with Russia and Ukraine and Afghanistan and Iraq, I go, when it comes to China, when they make their move, what's going to happen then? And that scares the shit out of me. And I don't even want to think about what happens when China decides, okay, we have enough power, now we're making our move. And that's when things get really scary. So, well, that's it for now. Again, if you are new to the channel, please like and subscribe. I'll see you next time.